Zero-sum thinking has been wrong. That doesn't mean that you can't get in trouble.
Every SaaS company under the sun has launched an AI product. They're not just sitting on their hands. And you'd think that they'd have a huge advantage given distribution, but we're just seeing classic innovator's dilemma.
GPT wrapper was this derogatory term. We've kind of come to the conclusion that's not even a thing. When someone writes software on whatever the cloud, you don't call it a cloud wrapper.
The success of these companies actually also reflects customer love, but I would also add on top of that tangible value that they're bringing their customers.
Conflicts really matter in this space. And so if you're too aggressive early and you don't really think through things, it can really keep you from investing in the one that's winning it.
Everybody, great to see you all. Martine, Sarah, we just went through the state of the firm. What's the state of play right now in AI?
The last 2.5 years have really felt like a blur. Maybe just to set the table, given that the AI landscape is changing so quickly, Martine and I thought it would be valuable for our internal team actually to reflect and take stock of where AI, or where value I should say, is accruing in the AI ecosystem. So the slides that you're about to see here are actually a product of our internal presentation to the GPs, where even we were surprised by some of the findings and wanted to share those today. So we're going to go through a lot of data and slides. I think it really distills into a couple of key takeaways, and that's one, AI companies are growing faster and are larger than even we expected. There's value accruing across every layer of the stack, models, infra, apps. All that being said, there's this paradox that we're seeing where more value creation is occurring in a shorter amount of time paired with more wipeout potential happening over a shorter period of time. We'll definitely dive into that dynamic more. And then finally, our conclusion is that you've got to be on the field, but you have to be smarter about where you're taking those bets than ever before because the stakes are higher.
Yeah, and I think as you're listening to this, it's probably worth pointing out that we've kind of come to the opinion that there is no AI. There's a bunch of subspaces that are totally different that all require their own strategy. So for example, the language models are very different than the diffusion models. The apps are very different than the models themselves. The tooling is different than that. And all these subspaces are very different. And so we're starting to learn that this is as big as software and the strategies need to vary as much.
Yeah. Let's put that first point you made more into perspective. What's the scale that we're talking about when we say foundation models are growing faster than expected?
Yeah, so this is a point that we thought was better answered actually through two charts rather than just chatting through it. And 2 years ago, I would have actually said we were probably the firm maybe the most bullish on where the market could go. Yeah. And I've got to say, even we are surprised by how large and fast-growing this market is. And if you look at the revenue of just two of the top-tier frontier labs, if you look at the chart on the left, not only have they surpassed the early revenue ramps of some of the best SaaS companies in history, I'll point you over to the right, they're actually starting to pass the early ramps of some of the hyperscalers. And I think these stats are even more these charts, I should say, are even more breathtaking when you think about just the timing of when their products launched. What we find even more exciting in this space is that it's not the case that just two companies are growing very quickly in AI. And in fact, that's probably a good segue to the next slide that shows markets are not only growing faster and much larger than expected, they're also fragmenting.
Let's get deeper into some examples. It's obvious OpenAI and Anthropic have tremendous growth opportunities ahead of them. But why are we excited for opportunities for leadership across the stack?
Yeah, so I'll jump in. So there was this view that OpenAI would win everything, or these large models would win everything early on. But if you actually look at the history to now, the last 3 years, it's been the opposite. So if you remember, what was the first use case that OpenAI did? Right? It was code. It was Copilot, right? But they lost that. And then they were actually the first to image really with DALL-E. But they lost that, right? Midjourney came up. They're kind of the first to real video with Sora. And they lost that. And yet they've gotten tremendous amount of value out of text. And so, like Sarah said, I think this is right. The primary takeaway is these markets are larger and they're growing faster than we expected. And so you result in fragmentation. So things before that we would have said oh, this is some sub thing and OpenAI will get it, or this is a minor market or whatever, ends up turning to be large enough to multiple companies with tremendous growth and tremendous value, right? And so we think kind of the only crime, this is going to be caveated later on, is zero-sum thinking, right? Like anybody that decried, defensibility isn't going to work has been wrong. Anybody that's decried like it's all going to aggregate has been wrong. So zero-sum thinking has been wrong. But that doesn't mean that you can't get in trouble. And so we'll talk about that.
It's funny because there was all this talk a year ago about GPT wrappers. Every app was a GPT wrapper. Foundation models going to win everything. What changed, and why aren't the foundation models winning everything?
Yeah, I think this is a fun one for a lot of the investors in the room because we don't all invest in just foundation models. And the fact that we're seeing this gangbusters growth in AI apps is really exciting to see. So I think two parts to your question. One, it makes sense that a lot of the focus and investment early on in this cycle was on the infrastructure side. And now what we're seeing is apps are benefiting from that massive investment as intelligence effectively has become free. And you have this aligning of the stars where the fierce competition on the state-of-the-art model market is driving both nonstop continued capability improvement paired with continuous price decreases. And in fact, I think model inference costs have gone down 10x year over year. So the stars, as we say, are aligning on that front. And then on your question of why don't the foundation models just take over everything? I think this is a question, it's a very reasonable question. It's one that we sort of ask ourselves for every new investment that we make. And we certainly saw this with the early marketing copy AI apps. But I think in talking to the founders of these app companies themselves, and then also the model providers, the answer to this question has become increasingly consistent. And that is where you have complex workflows and a ton of customer data where deep integrations actually are necessary to get that last mile value for the customer. This is where the specialized AI apps are sort of crushing any either foundation model layer or otherwise company in the market. We have actually a couple of examples that we'll cover on this, but to see that has been very interesting given the landscape initially was going in a different direction.
Yeah, I gotta say, GPT wrapper was this derogatory term, oh, that's it. I think we've kind of come to the conclusion, that's not even a thing. When someone writes software on whatever the cloud, you don't call it a cloud wrapper. You have all of the complexity in the software that's on top of these models. There's tremendous amount of opportunity to add value with traditional software, but also by building your own models. And so we kind of view that listen, this is an evolution in software. These models are an evolution in infrastructure, and there's tremendous opportunity to add value above the stack.
Someone tweeted that venture capital is just a wrapper around LP capital, or LP dollars. But yeah, to speak to the point. How should we think about AI native companies relative to traditional SaaS companies?
Yeah, this is an interesting one, and actually I think I'll go back to the charts just because they illustrate the point better than words could. But the first thing I'd call out that sort of just jumps off the page is that the AI native companies are far outpacing their SaaS counterparts. And you can see it in terms of new companies blowing past this golden metric of time to 100 million of ARR, which is truly an incredible feat to accomplish. On the left. But what's amazing is that it's not just the best companies that are doing really well. It's actually on average, you can see this from the aggregated Stripe data, where AI native companies are growing faster and than sort of the SaaS 2.0 generation, if you call it. And we'd sort of attribute this to a number of factors. One is just looking at the compelling ROI out of the box. And with AI improvements and capabilities, you're seeing this 10x plus improvement in the customer experience as well. Whereas SaaS 2.0, you generally saw a little bit more of an incremental improvement, call it 25, 50%. And then the second piece is it's early days for this, but and it's related, but you're starting to see replacement of some of the services budgets versus just software. And the second thing that I'd say on top of just the fact that the growth itself is happening is that the relative growth is particularly interesting when you take into account that every SaaS company under the sun has launched an AI product. They're not just sitting on their hands. And you'd think that they'd have a huge advantage given distribution. But we're just seeing classic innovator's dilemma starting to play out already. And the fact that they have revenue generating products where they have to devote time and resources changes the game for them. AI companies aren't building an AI product, they're just building a product. A lot of them are newer, and so they don't have this 2021 imposed remote culture. Most of the founders that we work with are in the office 6 to 7 days a week. And then finally, a lot of them tend to be these essentially applied AI engineers, where they're just incredible at wringing out every last drop of value from the LLM in a way that actually translates to customer value. It sort of circles back to the compelling ROI piece. And I think the results speak for themselves.
Something else we debated, which inspired this conversation, was defensibility, which is how should we think about defensibility for these companies? Are they defensible? Where does the defensibility come from? Does it come from state? Does it come from context? Does it come from brand? Some hybrid? Martine, why don't you take that?
Yeah, so I gotta say, like the actual data on this stuff is really noisy because everything's doing well, so it's kind of hard to have a theory. But if you actually kind of dig into it and you watch this thing for 3 years, like something seems to be pretty clear, and that is a really hard thing about building any startup or software is the bootstrap problem. Like, how do you get like the first 100, 200 customers? And like AI actually solves that problem. It just solves the bootstrap problem. It's like these models are so magical. So like, you wrap one of these models, you make it available, and people think it's amazing. They show up. But what's also clear is like that doesn't solve your retention problem if you're a software company, right? And so like it solves a very hard problem, but doesn't solve another problem. And so and arguably there's actually a lot of perverse economies of scale that are actually in play with these AI companies because like the models that commoditize very quickly, anybody can kind of use them, et cetera. And so what we found out is the pattern that seems to work is a startup will come and they'll do a model. And they'll get a bunch of users on that model, and that'll be great. But then they have to kind of revert to traditional software to build traditional moats, right? And so these moats can be anything. It could be a two-sided marketplace. It could be a long-tail integration mode. It could be a workflow moat. Whatever it is that we've figured out how to build in the past, they end up having to do. And so, but again, I mean, one last thing to notice is like some of these companies are growing so fast and the space is so new. Like we're even seeing effects that we haven't seen in a long time, like brand effects, right? Like these companies are like entering these massive vacuums, and then we all know them. And even though you're like the competition is just as good, right? Like I mean, like how much better is OpenAI than Anthropic? I don't know, but everybody seems to use it because of the brand. And so like when you know the name, you do this. And the early internet was like this. Like everybody knew Google and everybody knew Amazon, and you had these big brand moats. We're starting to see that come back again in this space. But there is no, as far as I can tell, as far as we can tell, there is no inherent endemic moat in the technology stack to AI, other than just overcoming the bootstrap problem.
Martine, let's double click on Cursor a bit.
The first kind of monetized AI app was Code, right? It was Copilot. And so Microsoft had invested a ton of money and matured the market with Copilot, with VS Code. And so everybody knew it. It's just like the models weren't quite ready then. And so you had, probably say 400 to 600 million in ARR of users out there and user behavior. So when Cursor came out, two things happened. They basically followed the same behavior that you saw in VS Code, which is like, this code editor is one. And the second thing is you had the RL wave where you have these models where they're using RL, so code just got way, way, way better, right? And so they just kind of like, it's a phenomenal team, very product focused. They caught the model wave and there's existing user behavior, and like the rest is kind of history. And like I mentioned just previously, this notion of brand, I mean, they just kind of entered the zeitgeist. And I can't tell you how often we'll have a founder show up and they're like, we're the Cursor for X.
Yeah, absolutely. The success of these companies actually also reflects obviously the customer love, but I would also add on top of that tangible value that they're bringing their customers. And I think one thing that's changed over the last 12 months is this shift from just, I need AI, like, experimental vibes buying, I'll call it, vibe, you have vibe coding, you have vibe enterprise AI purchasing, but to tangible ROI focus. And so two examples of that. On the Cursor side, we host these annual portfolio CTO dinners. And last year, in some of the questions that we'll throw out, of course, in the last few years, AI has come up for a significant portion of the dinner. And last year, it was notable that when we asked, hey, CTOs across 24 portfolio companies, how much is AI actually impacting your productivity? And the answer across the board was pretty much 10 to 15%. We're all using GitHub Copilot. Yeah. And, sort of the implication was that there's a lot of hype, not a lot of results. This year, I was pretty blown away by the answers that we got. They spanned from, call it 30 to 50% on the low end in terms of productivity gains, to, I kid you not, one CTO told us that he had seen a 10x productivity lift from himself and his team. They were all using Cursor. I think 24 out of 24 portfolio companies were using Cursor, and that 90% of the code in their company was AI generated. So this is in a short 12 months, maybe not even 12 months. And so you really are seeing this bump in hardcore ROI. And then on the Decagon side, I think customer support is another use case that has been hyped up, if you will, in terms of, hey, this could really have an impact on the industry. But the early results were, let's call it mixed. If you talk to a Decagon customer, they're actually slashing their customer support costs by up to 80%. And not only that, they're seeing deflection rates go up from 30% to anywhere from 60 to 80%. And their CSATs, their customer satisfaction scores, are doubling. So this is, like I said, tangible ROI, and that's what's really driving a lot of this growth. And honestly, it's the underlying productivity and impact gain that gets us really fired up.
Let's go deeper on the customer segmentation part. What are the ramifications of the fact that a lot of the growth is being driven by the prosumer market?
We should remember that every time we have a super cycle, it tends to start in these prosumer ways, right? The internet did this, right? Like, remember when Sun outlawed the browser, right? This is like Sun Microsystems, right? But they didn't really know how to consume it. So the enterprise doesn't know how to consume these new technologies, but there's clearly a lot of value. And so, the individuals pick them up and they use it. And then we're seeing a lot of the new behavior. And what's been very interesting is that has already led into enterprise pipeline like we've never seen. So if you actually look, I think they just hired an AE who closed $1 million deal on their first day, right? So they have more enterprise pipeline than we've ever seen. So the fact that these are prosumer businesses, like very specifically to your point, the fact that these are prosumer businesses is not in some way, because that's who they always sell to. It's just a natural maturation of the cycle. And if anything, it looks kind of far more promising than it did during the internet time.
I think that the high amount of prosumer revenue does mean that we're paying attention. I mean, we always pay attention to retention, but we're paying attention to it more than ever before. And a lot of these high growth apps are not your typical system of record, 95% gross dollar retention companies that we sort of saw in the 2010s. But importantly, that doesn't mean you should throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's not like, hey, these have terrible retention, and so these are terrible companies, right? I think the other piece is for the companies with questionable retention, that's something that we're being cautious about. Because the valuations that are being demanded in this market do require some sort of customer stickiness and base to build upon, or at least the ability to show that the top of funnel is actually converting into enterprise revenue, as Martine mentioned. And so this is an area that I think requires a lot of nuance and is one, frankly, that the team is spending a lot of time on.
So we've talked about the big winners, but there are also some big wipeouts, as we mentioned. What have we learned about the commonalities between ones that win and ones that don't?
I think what's interesting about this funding cycle in particular, and I know history repeats itself sometimes, but in this case, especially on the foundation model layer side, I think what's remarkable is just the massive size of the rounds that folks are raising before any traction. And we're participating in some of these rounds. We'll talk more about what our thesis is when we do. But as we all know, the more money you raise early on, the more pressure you have to really show performance. DG likes to call this transition going from a tell the story company to a show not tell company. So you really need to show not tell when you've raised hundreds of millions of dollars. So there's a couple of themes that we would flag. The key ones are passing on good but not exceptional teams has generally paid off. And then the second one I'd highlight is that, I think we wrote researcher vagaries, researcher-itis, as Martine and I call it, is a real thing. We've seen this up close and personal. It's particularly important given a lot of incumbents and Chinese companies are pouring money into these spaces, so it's really not for the faint of heart. And then finally, I think the point, the broader point that we'd make here is that this is not a market where a rising tide lifts all boats. Picking actually matters more than ever.
And it's also just important to realize that, unlike even crypto in the early days, conflicts really matter in this space. And so if you're too aggressive early and you don't really think through things, it can really keep you from investing in the one that's winning.
One of the bullet points in this slide is China's impact. Martin, why don't you talk about how what's happening in China affects our market?
Yeah, so let me just be very quick about that. It's kind of a mixed blessing, right? So on one hand, they build these great open source models. They're not kind of hindered by copyright. They're not kind of they get very cheap access to data. But on the other side, like historically, China's just not been able to build software, at least for like the prosumer enterprise market, which is kind of my world. They've just never really been able to do that. And so I think that, their ability to compete at like a software level is pretty limited. At a model level, they're actually quite good, but we benefit a lot from that. And of course, in the consumer space, like with TikTok, they've historically been very good, and so I think that's TBD. But for us, for me, I think it's a mixed blessing, but more of a blessing than not. I mean, I think it's actually great to have the competition, and it's great to have these models out there.
And it shifted the conversation on open source for some of the bigger players. Let's transition to our thesis. We talked about what to avoid in terms of pitfalls. Let's talk about what we're looking for, starting on the foundation model side.
Yeah, so we split the foundation models into kind of two, and I'll just talk about the SOTA models because everybody does. So the state-of-the-art model market, this is like the Anthropics and the OpenAIs. It's incredibly competitive, and it's very heavily subsidized, right? I mean, like with Meta and like Google, et cetera. And so kind of our view is you have to be very, very careful before you go into it. And there's a lot of companies you've never heard about that are in this space, right, that we avoid. So our view is, you really want to back the primary names that have done it before, that are able to raise capital and put together the best teams, right? So that we invested in Ilya. I mean, the guy's Oppenheimer, right? He's been close to every major advancement in the last 15 years in AI. So kind of our view when it comes to these state-of-the-art models is really just like the premium teams that can get the capital.
Yeah, exactly. I won't go into all the other thesis on the other categories one by one, but I think the common theme here, and you'll hear it over and over again during this, is that the thesis is to bet on market leaders with demonstrated momentum and are led by founders that are visionary in how they're applying AI to their verticals.
Let's close with one or two spicy takes. What's something that other firms think is real that we don't? Or vice versa.
And I think just at a high level, I'd say, it seems like a lot of firms are failing on either side of this. Like some of them are like, it's not real. We're not going to invest. And it's amazing, like some firms that were very, very relevant, we just never see anymore. I mean, like the founders don't talk about them. They're not there. They're not in the deals. It's been, for the 10 years I've been doing this, the most remarkable transition. And then there's others that got so excited so early and did all the deals. And like I mentioned, they got conflicted out. Like, they're dealing with a lot of companies that aren't working. And so, I mean, we think you have to be very thoughtful and realize that this is kind of its own space, that you need to have the same level of sophistication for any software.
Yeah. In closing, what are the key messages we want to leave this audience with? Sarah, take it away.
Great. So we kept this slide simple, and you've already heard these messages over and over again, but they really are the key ones that we want to impart from our work and the way that we think about investing. And that is, the market is growing faster, and it's larger than anyone anticipated, most of all us. You've got to be really thoughtful about where you're placing the bets. The stakes are higher than ever. And this is a market where heat cannot be confused with momentum. And then finally, as Martin said, you're on the field or you're irrelevant. We're incredibly bullish on the opportunity ahead, and we think this is just the beginning.
Thank you so
much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Sarah.
Yep, thank you.